Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Today, I have Christian Scholz with us to talk about the philosophy of mind, the importance of visual imagery, and his concept of meta-imagination. Chris, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yes, hi Tom. Thank you very much for allowing me to be here. I'm really excited to be speaking in front of the Aphantasia community because naturally, if you have theories about aphantasia, the people that you want to get feedback from is the aphantasic community. So in many ways, for me to talk to you today is even more exciting to speak to other academics about this. So just to give you very quickly background on myself. So right now, I'm basically working in the Institute for Philosophy 2 at the Ruhr University Bochum. So I'm doing my PhD in philosophy, but initially I started out doing psychology. So I have a master in clinical psychology, and then I decided to do a second master in logic. And during my time in logic, I learned about aphantasia, and I was initially very, very fascinated with it because it has very interesting implications for the philosophy of language, but also the philosophy of mind. And so I managed to convince my supervisors that I'm allowed to write my thesis about aphantasia. And I think this also very naturally brings us to the presentation itself, because I will be presenting parts of my thesis today to you. And yeah, I'm very excited to be here.
Me too. Very much looking forward to it. So I'll hand it over to you, Chris. And once you're finished, we'll come back and answer any questions that the community might have. So for anyone who's joining us live, feel free to add your comments or questions throughout the presentation, and we'll get to them when Chris is done. So without any further ado, Chris, take it away.
Yes, thank you very much. So as you can see, the title of my talk will be Meta-Imagination and the Unimportance of Visual Mental Imagery. And as I said, I will be presenting parts from my master thesis that I wrote on this subject. And in this thesis, I try to analyze aphantasia from the perspective of the philosophy of the 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, of whom you can already see a quote in the upper corner there. So very quickly, to give you an overview of this talk, I'll give you a very brief introduction to the topic. And then in the first half of the talk, I'll be talking about Wittgenstein. Obviously, I will not be able to really go in depth on his philosophical system because it's very dense and very complex, but I will try to pick out 3 ideas that I think are very useful when we talk about mental images and also about aphantasia. And then in the second half of the talk, I will try to convince you of my own theoretical concept, which I call meta-imagination, and show you how I build it on the Wittgensteinian ideas, and then try to show you some of the applications in the context of aphantasia. Okay, so very briefly, as an introduction, I don't need to tell you about this, but mental imagery can be understood as a sort of vividness spectrum, right? So on the one end of the spectrum, you have hyperphantasia, which is defined as a condition of mental imagery as vivid as real seeing, right? So this would be number 1 here. And on the other end of the spectrum, you would have aphantasia, which is defined as a condition of reduced or absent imagery. And this definition was coined by Adam Seemann in 2015, so it's still rather new. And of course, the spectrum is continuous, so there's not only 5 options, but I think that makes sense. Now, why is aphantasia so interesting? It is very interesting because it presents us with a sort of puzzle, because contemporary philosophy and cognitive science attribute great importance to mental imagery for our overall cognition. And this is by no means a new thing, because you can go back as far as 350 BC to the time of Aristotle, where he said that the soul never thinks without an image. And then you can also go to the beginning of the 20th century, for example, when you have something like the imageless thought controversy, which is a debate amongst experimental psychologists. And the topic of the debate is, again, is thought without images even possible? So you can see that there is this kind of like tie-up between images and thought, and this idea that images are necessary for thought. But if that were so, then of course people who are aphantasics, so people who do not have images, should not be able to think, right? They should be gravely cognitively impaired. However, there are many, many results by now showing that this is not the case. So aphantasics function normally on a range of cognitive tasks, and what is even more interesting is that they're even successfully performing tasks which were expected to require the use of visualization. And on some of these tasks, they're even outperforming actual visualizers. Now, I will not talk about these experiments today in the presentation. Today, I'll try to give you more of a general picture kind of idea. But if you're interested in these experiments, you can look at my thesis. So this paradox surrounding aphantasia is pretty good summarized by Seemann himself, who says in 2020 that The discovery that some people get along fine in the absence of visualization is striking. So the question that I'm trying to answer is, well, how can aphantasics function so well without visual mental imagery? And the answer that I will be providing is, well, it's because visualization is not that important. And in this presentation today, I will try to show you this idea by looking at somewhat like everyday instances of how we can use imagination. Now, first, of course, we have to ask ourselves, so what is mental imagery? And there we can see that mental imagery usually is being identified with a sort of quasi-perceptual experience. So a perceptual experience is something like seeing an object, right? Like seeing this cup right now. So this is an external stimuli that is causing a certain experience in me, which we call seeing. And then a quasi-perceptual experience would be seeing something that is not there, right? Closing my eyes and visualizing a cup. So I still have the experience as if I'm seeing something, but there's no external stimuli causing this experience. Now, there are also other definitions. So for example, you could take a neuroscientific approach. You could say that maybe a specific brain state or brain activation is what we identify as mental imagery, but that is less common. It's more commonly understood as this subjective experience that the imaginer has. And that's, of course, also where we come to the idea that mental imagery is some sort of seeing with the mind's eye, right? Something that Adam Seemann also says quite a lot himself. Now, let's come to the first part of this talk, namely Wittgenstein. And as a very brief introduction, so Ludwig Wittgenstein is one of the most important, and by some even considered to be the most important 20th century philosopher. And especially in his late philosophy, he was very interested in language and practices. So activities that are being performed in a community, right? And one of the most important concepts that he has in his late philosophy is that of a language game, which he defines as language and the activities into which it is woven. But you can also just think about it in terms of how we're using words in a community. And this aspect of the community is very important to Wittgenstein because he says that language is essentially public. So there's no such thing as a private language. A language necessarily has to be spoken by multiple people. And then he says that once we have these language games, once we know how these terms are being used, we should see how they're connected. So for example, how the language game of seeing is connected with that of visualizing. So the first concept, the first idea that I want to talk about in a bit more depth is that of the language games. So for Wittgenstein, language games have rules, just how games like chess or backgammon have rules, and they also have a point. But what is very important to understand is that there is not just one language game of any term. So there's not just one language game of visualizing, for example. Instead, there's a multitude of practices that involve the use of the term, and each of these, according to Wittgenstein, has its own set of rules and its own point. So context really matters. And in order to show you this idea, let's look at an example. So let's think about the broader context of a man witnessing a violent robbery, right? And now, in the first scenario, this man is going to the police station and he's trying to give a description for a police sketch. So we're here interested in the use of the term visualize, right? So the policeman says, try to visualize the criminal. What do you see? And now imagine that the man says, I see a black cat with sharp claws. Well, that would strike you as odd, right? And rightfully so, because this would actually be a rule break in this context. Because the point of this specific language game is that you're trying to give a description that resembles the criminal as much as possible, right? So the goal is to be realistic, and because of that, describing a man as a cat is a rule break in this context, the point of which is catching the criminal. But now think about a different scenario. So think about maybe the man, instead of going to the police, is going to art therapy, maybe to deal with the trauma of having witnessed the robbery. And now let's look again at the same conversation. Now the therapist says, try to visualize the criminal. What do you see? And the man again says, I see a black cat with sharp claws. Well, notice that in this context, there's actually no rule break. And that is because in the context of the art therapy scenario, you're actually being encouraged to be creative, right? You're supposed to give a description of your own impression, interpretation of what was going on. And maybe the robber was dressed in black, maybe he had a knife, and you interpret that creatively as a black cat with sharp claws, right? So because the point is to express yourself, even though exactly the same thing happens linguistically, there's no rule break in comparison to the police sketch scenario. So we see that the context, the point of the context, determines the rules. Now, the second thing that I really want to stress is the importance of the community in Wittgenstein's philosophy. And in order to do that, we will go through what is called the beetle in the box argument from his philosophical investigations. So we read through together. Wittgenstein says, suppose that everyone had a box with something in it which we call a beetle. No one can ever look into anyone else's box, and everyone says he knows what a beetle is only by looking at his beetle. Here would be quite possible for everyone to have something different in his box. One might even imagine such a thing constantly changing. So what Wittgenstein is saying here is, and he's using the beetle as a sort of metaphor for our private personal experience. He's saying that this private experience is inaccessible from the perspective of other people, right? So I can describe my personal experience of, for example, a mental image, but you can never look at my mental image in the same way as you could look, for example, at this phone, which is publicly accessible. And because of that, it might very well be the case that two people have the same experience, but they use different words to describe it, or they might have different experiences, but use the same words to describe it nonetheless. And then Wittgenstein goes on to say, but what if these people's word beetle had a use nonetheless? If so, it would not be the name of a thing. The thing in the box doesn't belong to the language game at all, not even as a something, for the box might even be empty. And now it might be quite tempting to maybe interpret this last part of the quote, this idea of the box being empty, and think that this might be some sort of description of aphantasia. So this idea that maybe aphantasia is just a state where the box is always empty, and indeed this is an interpretation that Fox-Muraton makes in one of her papers. However, I don't think that this is actually the point that Wittgenstein is trying to make. He's not talking about the contents of the box, about the personal experience. That is not the important point. The point is that he is saying that as long as we use a term, well, then that term is not referring to our private experience at all. If we use a term, then it is grounded in the practices of the community. It is grounded in the use that it has for and in that community, right? Not in the quasi-perceptual experience. So this, of course, relates again to the idea of the language game. So we see here that the meaning of the term, so beetle or mental image, etc., is defined by its use in or for the community and not by the individual experience. And this connects to the third point that I want to talk about, namely the idea of medium of representation in Wittgenstein's philosophy. So recall that if we think about mental imagery and the definitions that I've shown you so far, it always involves this quasi-perceptual experience, right? Like this experience as if seeing something with your mind's eye. Well, this is not the case in Wittgenstein's definition of the mental image. So Wittgenstein says, a mental image is the image that is described when someone describes what he imagines. So notice that there is no reference to any sort of quasi-perceptual experience. The only thing that Wittgenstein says is important for somebody to have a mental image is that they are able to describe what they are imagining. And if you ask yourself, well, how could such a description look like? Well, Wittgenstein says at another point, suppose that while imagining, or instead of imagining, someone were to draw, even if only in the air with his finger. It is just as if he had given a verbal description, which, after all, can also take the place of the image. And now this is very important to understand correctly. So Wittgenstein is not saying that there is a private quasi-perceptual experience, right, which is the mental image, and then we just have different ways of describing it. What he is saying is that these descriptions essentially are the mental image. They take the place of the image. And he generalizes this even further at a different point when he says, instead of imaginability, one can say here representability in a particular medium of representation, right? So for Wittgenstein, the only thing that you need to be able to imagine something is to be able to represent some informational content in a medium of representation, such as a description. So we can see that on Wittgenstein's reading, actually, one can have mental images without just quasi-perceptual experiences. And this now concludes the first half of our talk. So let's quickly summarize what we've seen so far. So I've told you that in general, mental imagery is usually understood as referring to this quasi-perceptual experience, right? This seeing with the mind's eye. And usually this is being understood as referring to this subjective experience, or in some cases also to some sort of objective data, right? Like brain imaging data, which we'll not really look at here in this presentation. Now, however, Wittgenstein has a quite different approach. He says that the use of the term mental images is grounded in the practices of the community, the use that it has for the community. And therefore, he is neither taking a subjective nor an objective approach. He's taking an intersubjective approach, and he's interested in intersubjective behavior. And furthermore, we've seen that for Wittgenstein, there can be multiple media of representation, right? Multiple media in which you can represent what you're imagining, such as verbal descriptions or drawing or pointing or else. So just to reiterate this last point again, because I think it's really quite important, the quasi-perceptual experience is not necessary, according to Wittgenstein, to represent what one imagines. And now we come to the second part, where I will try to show you, well, my own concept of meta-imagination and try to convince you that this is actually a viable concept that will help us to understand the experience of aphantasics. And in order to do so, let us first ask ourselves, how do we use our imagination? And I think that, there are possibly endless ways that you could come up with examples for uses of imagination. I'll just tell you two that I came up with. So, for example, you could imagine that you are a pirate, right? Or you could imagine that there's a detective, maybe roaming the streets of Vienna. You can go into as much detail as you want. Now, recall that Wittgenstein said that there's always a point to our activities, right? So let's come up with a point. For example, if I'm imagining being a pirate, the point of that might be that I'm engaging in pretend play with my niece, right? Or if I'm imagining that there's a detective, well, maybe the point is that I'm trying to write a noir novel. And of course, there can be, very different points as well. These are just two examples. Now, what I want to do is I want to try to provide a definition, a more general definition of what imaginative episodes are like, or how we should define them. So I'm proposing the following. A voluntary imaginative episode, short VAE, is a volitional mental activity whereby an agent A represents a possible state of affairs as to themselves. And this now might sound a bit technical, but all that it's saying is basically just that imaginative episodes are mental activities by which we represent something to ourselves, right? Representing that I'm a pirate, representing that there's a detective. And what I want to do now is I first want to give you the definition of my concept of meta-imagination, and then afterwards tell you how I arrived at it. So I define meta-imagination as acting as if visualizing without visualizing. And this is kind of like the important concept of this presentation. And now I want to tell you how I came up with this. So I essentially asked myself, how do we use the term imagination? And again, you will see that there's not one straightforward interpretation of this, right? Depending on the context, you can interpret the term in different ways. So one possible interpretation would be to think about what I would call acting imagination, or imagination one. And acting imagination refers to the performance of observable acts corresponding to the content of a voluntary imaginative episode. So for example, the content of the episode could be imagining being a pirate, right? With the point of engaging in a pretend play with my niece. And I might say to her, look, Captain, there's Blackbeard's ship, right? So I'm performing observable acts which are corresponding to this content of imagining being a pirate, right? And so imagining one can be read as to act as if. And then there's another way how you can interpret the term. There are way more ways that you can interpret it, but let's just look at one more. And this would be this idea of visualizing imagination, or what I call imagination two. So visualizing imagination refers to the act of generating a quasi-perceptual experience corresponding to the content of a VAE. So for example, in the case of imagining that you're a pirate, maybe you are actually visualizing a pirate ship. But notice very importantly that in order to engage into acting imagination, you do not actually need to visualize anything, right? I can just say, Captain, look, there's Blackbeard's ship, without having to visualize Blackbeard's ship. And this is very important. So now, imagining two, in the sense of visualizing imagination, can be read as to visualize. And now, I propose the definition for a meta-imaginative act to be an act that occurs when an agent acts as if they are visualizing, right? So I'm kind of using here these two interpretations of the word imagine, because you might also say, well, a meta-imaginative act is when an agent imagines in the first sense that they're imagining in the second sense, and hence the name of meta-imagination. And now I want to explore this concept a little bit more with you. But before I do that, I want to make one thing very clear. Namely, when I'm talking about acting as if, I'm not in any way meaning that aphantasics are pretending or that they're trying to deceive others. I will say more on this later, but it's already important to point this out. So I'm not thinking about the aphantasic as a manipulator in any way. So now let's look back at the idea of the language game. So recall that for Wittgenstein, language games was the way how we use words in our community. And recall also that for him, there was not just one language game of any particular term, like visualization. There's only a multitude of practices that involve the term. However, I now slightly want to shift that definition by providing my own definition of language games. And I call this language games star. And I will not now always say the star, but when you see the star on the slides, that means that I'm talking about language games in my interpretation and not in the strictly Wittgensteinian sense. And also from now on, whenever I say language games, I will mean language games star. So language game stars I define as a set of general expected behaviors that arise when one uses a term, for example, seeing or visualizing, that apply across practices, right? Across contexts. So there are some expectations that are involved in both the police sketch scenario and the art therapy scenario. But in order to understand this a bit better, let's look again at some new examples. So imagine that you're on a phone call with your friend, and your friend is telling you, I see a ball laying in front of me right now. So then you might ask your friend, well, what does it look like? And now imagine that your friend says, I don't know. Well, this would strike you as odd, right? And rightfully so, because this would actually be a rule break. Because saying I see something but don't know what that something looks like just makes no sense. When I'm telling you that I'm seeing something, you can expect me to be able to give you some information on the visual details of that something that I'm seeing, right? And this then defines the language game of seeing, in my sense, which is the language game of seeing X consists of an agent reporting on the visual details of X, right? So for example, on the ball's color, the ball's size, whether it's clean or dirty, etc. But now think about this. Think about your friend saying, I am visualizing a ball right now. And you ask, well, what does it look like? And your friend says again, I don't know. Well, notice that this is also actually a rule break. Because just as in the case of seeing, if I tell you that I'm visualizing something, but I cannot describe to you what it looks like, that doesn't make sense, right? Because visualization is associated with this quasi-perceptual experience. I should be seeing something, so I should be able to report on it in some way. And that then means that the language game of visualizing X also consists of an agent reporting on the visual details of X. So on the imaginary ball color or the imaginative ball size, right? So notice that the important thing here is that one plays the language game of visualizing by means of giving a verbal or non-verbal description of what they are imagining. But now ask yourself, do you actually need to have a quasi-perceptual experience in order to do so? So think, for example, about the imaginative episode where you imagine that there's a detective and say you want to describe what that detective looks like. Do you need to visualize a detective in order to describe how they look? Well, I would say no. No, you know what detectives might look like, right? So you just need knowledge and creativity in order to describe how one would look like. And as we've seen on multiple articles from the Aphantasia network, actually, well, not being able to visualize does not mean that you are not creative. So the crucial question that you have to ask yourself if you want to imagine something is actually, well, how would or could X look like, right? And I argue that if you know how something would or could look like, then you can actually use meta-imagination, meaning you can act as if you're visualizing. And I will give a very concrete example on that shortly. But this brings me to a very important conclusion, namely, I will argue that aphantasics actually can play the language game of visualizing by means of engaging in meta-imagination, by simply acting as if they're visualizing. And in order to understand this a little bit better, we have to ask ourselves how the imaginative episode would actually be like for aphantasics. So one idea might be to say, well, aphantasics cannot visualize and therefore they do not experience any voluntary imaginative episodes. But I think that this is very wrong. And in order to argue against this, I will use this example, which is probably quite popular in the community as well, the example by Ross, who is an aphantasic, who is describing his imaginative episode of imagining a beach. So Ross says, if you tell me to imagine a beach, I ruminate on the concept of a beach. I know there's sand, I know there's water, I know there's a sun, maybe lifeguard. I know facts about beaches. I know a beach when I see it, and I can do verbal gymnastics with the word itself. But I cannot flash the beaches I've visited. I have no capacity to create any kind of mental image of a beach, whether I close my eyes or open them, whether I'm reading the word in a book or concentrating on the idea for hours at a time, or whether I'm standing on the beach itself. And I grew up in Miami. So what we can see here is that while Ross does not have any quasi-perceptual experience, he's not having an experience of seeing the beach with his mind's eye, he can still access the concept of a beach. And I think that we can really cash in on this when we look at another philosophical distinction, namely that of the type token distinction. And this goes also back to the beginning of the 20th century, although not to Wittgenstein, but to C.S. Peirce. And it's really quite simple to understand. So a token is a concrete instantiation of a class. So think about the class of all cats, right? And then a token cat would be a specific cat. So for example, my friend's cat, Lulu. The type, on the other hand, is the class itself. It is an abstract concept. So it is the concept cat, right? And notice that the type cat, the abstract cat, does not have any fixed visual details, right? It has no specific fur color or size, etc., because it has to be abstract. And now I'm arguing in my thesis that we can use this distinction, and I'm proposing to apply it to imagery. So I'm proposing what I call the type token imagery distinction. So here again, we have this distinction between type and token. So think now for a second about hyperphantasics, right? People whose imagery is as vivid as real seeing. Now, if they're imagining a cat, I'm arguing that because they will have this quasi-perceptual experience that is like seeing a cat, they will be imagining a specific cat with a specific fur color, size, and so on and so forth. It will be a token imaginary cat. However, although aphantasics, of course, do not have this quasi-perceptual experience, so they do not have direct access to this token imagery, they nonetheless should not be understood as having no imagery at all, but they should be understood as having what I call type imagery, right? So imagery at the type level, abstract imagery. They would access the abstract concept cat, right? Or in the case of Ross, beach. And notice here again that type imagery does not involve any quasi-perceptual experience. But now comes the truly interesting argument, I would say, because I say that aphantasics nonetheless have indirect access to the token level of imagery. They don't have direct access, but they have indirect access. In order to explain you this, let us think again about the imaginative episodes. So let's take the example again of imagining a beach. If an aphantasic imagines a beach, they access the type beach, the abstract concept beach, right? And this then will trigger all sorts of knowledge or associations. So for example, you know that there are sand beach, rocky beaches, pebble beaches, there's water, there might be a sun or a lifeguard, and see how this is mirroring very much the quote from Ross when he was describing his imaginative episode, right? And then as you're thinking about concepts like, let's say, palm trees, maybe a memory pops up. Maybe a memory of you playing cards in the shadow of palm trees as a kid. And maybe then that triggers another memory or more knowledge or more associations and so on and so forth. And all of this is already happening. This is your imaginative episode, and it doesn't involve any quasi-perceptual experience. Now, what I'm arguing is that you can actually build a token level beach out of this by just fixing some of the details that are already in your episode. So for example, you could say, well, my beach is a sand beach and there's water and there's sun, but there's no lifeguard, but there are palm trees and so on and so forth. And this you can put into an actual verbal description. And now just imagine that you use the word see to do so. And then you would get something like this. I see sand and water. The sun is shining. I see palm trees, and in the shadow of the palm trees, I see a group of people playing cards. But now notice that this is actually a token level description, right? Because it includes specific visual details. You're describing a specific beach. The beach is no longer abstract. And this is why I'm arguing that while aphantasic imagery starts at the abstract, at the type level, aphantasics can nonetheless, by means of using knowledge, associations, and memories, give token-level descriptions by means of meta-imagining. And I just want to say one more, final thought before we're wrapping up, because I'm almost out of time. And this is bringing it back to this idea of saying, well, I'm not saying that aphantasics are pretending or manipulating. Now, of course, there could be an interpretation where you say, well, meta-imagination is a sort of tool, and aphantasics, knowing that they cannot visualize, they use it in order to deceive visualizers and try to act as if they can visualize, right? And that might be the case, but I think what is way more important is to see meta-imagination as a factual description, right? Because aphantasics do, in fact, act as if they visualize all the time. How else would it come that more than 10,000 lifelong aphantasics have not even realized that they were not able to visualize, right? How come their partners, assuming that their partners are visualizers or even maybe hyperphantasics, have not realized that either? And thinking about aphantasia just being coined only in 2015 should really raise some awareness, right? Well, I think that we should once more look at Wittgenstein, specifically at the importance of the community. And for this, I want to do the last final thought experiment with you, which I call the aphantasic child learns to visualize an apple. So imagine that there's a aphantasic child, let's call her Anna, and let's say Anna is in kindergarten. And one day she observes that the kindergartner tells another kid to visualize an apple. And what Anna is observing is that the other kid is giving a verbal description of an apple that is not there. And maybe also the other kid is, closing its eyes, right? So what Anna is learning is that the language game of visualizing an apple consists of giving a verbal description of an apple that is not there and maybe also closing your eyes. And assuming that the other kid is maybe a normal visualizer, even a hyperphantasic, there is also this quasi-perceptual experience, right? But it's private, and because of that, it's inaccessible to Anna, right? It does not play a role in the language game at all, as Wittgenstein was saying in the beetle in the box argument. So now imagine the next day the kindergartner comes to Anna and says, well, now you visualize a beach. And so Anna does as she has learned. She closes her eyes and she gives a verbal description of the beach that is not there. Now, she doesn't have any quasi-perceptual experience. She's not seeing an apple in her mind, right? But she has the knowledge, the associations, and memories that enable her to give the description, just as we now saw in the example of imagining a beach. And now notice that if she does so, the kindergartner will not tell her that she did anything wrong. She's not breaking any rules, because the language game of visualizing indeed just consists of reporting the visual details of that which you're visualizing. And because of that, Anna will grow up decades and decades and decades thinking that she can actually visualize, not knowing anything about the quasi-perceptual experience. And that experience is not necessary for other people to believe that she is visualizing as well, right? So this is kind of like the important part. Lifelong aphantasics successfully play the language game of visualizing for decades, because in order to play the game correctly, they do not have to actually visualize. They do not have to have this quasi-perceptual experience. They merely have to meta-imagine, which, as I've shown, hopefully in this presentation, they can do. Now, very quickly, a little teaser, because if you think back, you might remember that Wittgenstein defined the mental image as the image that is described when someone describes what he imagines, right? And now we've seen that aphantasics actually can, describe what they're imagining. So here's a thought. If aphantasics can play the language game of visualizing, meaning that they can describe at the token level what they imagine, then following Wittgenstein's definition of mental images, aphantasics do have mental images, right? I will not say more about this at this point, but if you're interested in more, you can look up my thesis. You'll find it easily on Google Scholar. Just type in imaginability as representability. Okay, but now let's conclude. So what I've done in this presentation is I've defined the concept of meta-imagination, which I define as acting as if visualizing without actually visualizing. Then I have introduced what I call the language game of visualizing, which consists of reporting on the visual details of that which you're imagining. And I've argued that aphantasics can play this language game of visualizing by means of using meta-imagination. And then I further sharpened this argument by introducing the type-token imagery distinction. And I've argued that while aphantasics start at the abstract type level of the imagery content, they can nonetheless access by means of memories, associations, and knowledge the token level and give token level descriptions of their imaginings, meaning that they can use meta-imagination. So coming back to the question from the beginning, how can aphantasics function so well without visual imagery? Well, the answer that I want to give is that for many visual imagery tasks, agents merely need to meta-imagine. They have to act as they're visualizing instead of actually visualizing. And in my thesis, I also show this with respect to experimental tasks and experimental settings and also neuroscience. But today I just wanted to give a more, broad overview of how we can use the concept of meta-imagination in more everyday context. So I hope that I've succeeded to convince you that meta-imagination is a useful theoretical concept that can be used in the discourse on aphantasia. And I hope that I also convince you that visualization in the end is not as important as we might imagine. Thank you very much.